Welcome back from lunch, and as I was telling these folks that there must be a news blackout at DOJ because they're all here. Pretty much everybody, easily the most senior, no offense, Carrie and Barry, most senior correspondents at DOJ. We're fortunate to have with us today as we continue looking at how DOJ functions. And I think it's fair to say no agency in government has been subjected to such a hostile takeover than DOJ and Trump 2.0. From purges of career officials that continued through yesterday, who were deemed to be disloyal, to the dismissal of criminal cases that have nothing to do with the strength of evidence. Think about that for a moment. But few know the department better than the members of this panel. Pierre Thomas at ABC News, Devlin Barrett of the New York Times, Carrie Johnson of NPR, and Perry Stein of the Washington Post. Again, I'm not sure where they have found the time, but we are very grateful to them to come and discuss DOJ's head-spinning transformation, what it means for the press corps, and pursuing accountability at breakneck pace. So please welcome this distinguished group. And I wanted to sort of start out just by asking a question, and it is about accountability. And given the disdain for the press that this administration clearly has, what people and lawmakers on the Hill have expressed as well, I wonder if the notion of accountability as you know it has changed, and whether it affects the way you report. I mean, by that I mean it used to be that you'd write a story and then members of the administration would react, change policy, whatever. Lawmakers would pass legislation that would reacting to what you wrote. And I wonder if a new formula has to be developed to sort of pursue the accountability that used to be inherent to the work.
I'll take a horrible first stab at that. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the microphone, sincerely. So I think a couple things have changed. One, the formula you described, I think, doesn't exist anymore, in part just because lawmakers don't really pass legislation anymore. You know, that used to be a much larger part of the job. I don't come across that very much. I'm not saying they never pass a bill, but I'm saying most of the bills they pass involve renaming buildings, which aren't, big policy decisions. So I think in that sense, has the sort of tempo and rhythms of accountability work in Washington changed? Sure. But I also think, whatever people think of us, on good days and bad days, and maybe, they never think of us, some people, the job doesn't stay the same. The job doesn't change. The accountability work continues. And I think it is only a reminder of what I sort of already know and already do, is that I don't think we, in the terms of reporting, should really sort of be angry or shouty when we do reporting. I think, we all cover pretty important subjects, like, the cases we cover, the issues we cover, the people who make big decisions that have pretty big consequences in the country. Like, those are important things. And the fact that we're not shouting about it does not mean that it's not important, does not mean that we're not fully committed to the work. So my answer would be no, and in a broader sense, I don't think our piece of the accountability, dance has changed at all, even if other actors in town have sort of changed what they do and how they think about it.
Yeah, I just add that one of the things I've been hearing from sources since January or December, I have a mic. I'm mic'd. Yeah, I'm mic'd. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay. One of the things I've been hearing from sources since December or January is that they don't necessarily count on members of Congress to step in. and act as a check on most of the administration's actions, at least not yet. And as a result, what I'm hearing from people is the journalists are where the accountability needs to happen. And I think that's true. And I think that's a very important responsibility and one that we work pretty hard every day to try to carry out. Even though it's early days, the administration has backtracked on a few occasions because of public opinion. And as we get closer to the midterm elections next year, that may happen more often as may members of Congress start to act. But for the time being, people like us are sometimes the only avenue for allegations of wrongdoing and whistleblowers and the like. And so I think our job has never been more important in the 28, 29 years I've been a reporter in DC.
Go ahead.
I would also say I have been thinking of this question a lot because it does look very, as they've all said, look very different this administration. I covered DOJ during Biden, and before that covered, the mayor and local stuff. And when you think of accountability, you usually think of, I just found this wrongdoing. The administration's going to be super pissed at me. Like that was a great accountability story that I did. But in this administration, I'm finding sometimes accountability, I think, just looks like, there's so much news going on. I think it's important to just get this on the record to say, look, this is what happened. And that may be the accountability story. Or, and this is kind of a thing that I'm also learning, I didn't cover Trump 1, that what you think may think of as a negative story that really shows wrongdoing or shows something that's different, they may think it looks really good. And that doesn't mean that it's not an accountability story. It doesn't have to be a got you story. I just did one story right now that I thought, this is a pretty good account. It required source work, it required all this stuff and what you think of as traditional accountability reporting. But I think that the administration thought that story made them look really good, while others thought it made them look really bad. But I still think it doesn't matter how people perceive it, and it is still accountability. It is still on the record, and it is still open for people to read and understand what's going on.
I think if there's going to be a theme today that you're going to find throughout this conversation is that whatever the dynamic is, and each administration, each iteration of an administration, the dynamic changes. And while some may perceive this to be a more hostile environment for journalists, we have to be consistent in what we do and how we do it. That is what I believe. I was at a dinner last night in which I was emceeing, and one of the honorees was Leslie Stahl. And she made a very profound point that, in many ways, journalists are to be on the battlefield, sometimes taking incoming but not responding in kind. That's not our job to say, you're bad, you awful people. No, the job is to report, present the information, and keep doing it over and over and over again. Period, full stop. And to the degree, if we can keep it that simple, and I know it's more complicated than that, but in essence, that's what we have to do. Even, and I think as the temperature rises, we have to even be more disciplined to focus on, who, what, when, where, why, and to show up even when people don't return our phone calls and let them know, look, the story is going to still get covered. Now, the challenge is when sometimes, who an administration chooses to speak to or not to speak to can present a challenge. Sure. But we still have a job to do. And we, for example, we can cover the Justice Department even if no one ever briefs us, right? Because they're going to put out a release. There will be a court document, and we can go cover the document and then use sourcing that we have to come up with our best version of what we can determine to be the truth is at that time. And at some point at the Justice Department, there's always a moment I've found where the people come in, and and I think you would agree with me, a lot of the people usually who are the PR, public affairs directors, are usually people who come from the political side. If you look at their background, they were with the RNC or they were with the DNC or they were with this campaign or that campaign. And then what I found is something will happen that is significant. It could be a mass shooting, it could be a terrorist attack or whatever. And they realize that we're coming to them for information that's not about politics. We're trying to find what happened, how many people died, who is responsible. And so I hope that there will always be the thing that, at least on our beat, that ends up driving it over time.
One follow-up, and I'll throw it out to you all. But given the pace of things today, and I've never seen it quite like this, this goes beyond Trump 1, and at the Justice Department especially, FBI, how difficult has it been to pick, the piece that's going to resonate? And I see your names all over multiple stories a day, but I wonder, whether or not there's more thought going into what you choose to focus on versus the last Trump term, when we're literally running from fire to fire. But
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought story selection is the hardest part about being a beat journalist, or one of the most important parts that can, make it so you're successful or not successful on a beat. And I think it has never been more true this administration, because you just can't do everything. And we're only, 2 months into it, 2 months. And we're still constantly having talks with my, editor as to what makes sense to do. And sometimes it's as random as well, that kind of interests me. But, I think we have to pick what is the most important. Sometimes we say, okay, maybe we can wait 3 days and see if we can get 3 more examples of this and do a bigger story. Or sometimes, we mess up and we see that another one of our competitors has a story that we opted not to have, and we think that, oh God, we probably should have done that. And I think it is constantly, I hope we get better at it, but we just can't do everything. And sometimes you just have to say, well, it's important it gets covered, and I'm glad my competitors covered it. But I think that's a constant conversation. And I don't think, I'm interested to hear their answers, but I think it's a good question, because one that I think we're all going to have to be constantly figuring out throughout this administration.
This answer will be very boring for Perry, because I preach about this a lot when she and I work together. The job is mostly triage. I would argue if you're doing a beat well, the job is mostly triage. It's especially triage right now because it's a new administration and they're throwing a lot of stuff out there most days. I think there's a danger when you're very busy. I think there's a danger of overthinking and overplanning. In my own head, I try to dumb things down as much as possible. And one of the things I always fall back on is I used to be a cops reporter, just a straight street crime reporter. And, when you do that, you sort of learn that you always have to give yourself the energy and the time to handle the next shooting, because whatever you're doing, if you plan out your day, so that every hour is full, you will have screwed yourself. Sorry to use bad words. I know there's some children here. And so I deliberately try as much as possible to both do triage and as much as possible count on gap time, because I assume life and reality and chaos will fill that gap.
excuse me, get your water.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And from a network television perspective, it's a little easier because we are only going to do the broadest and most important story. And sometimes the challenge is trying to figure out, okay, I've been collecting this fodder on these sundry things, and when does it coalesce to enough where I can get it on Good Morning, thank you so much, get it on Good Morning America or World News Tonight with David Muir or the Sunday Talk Show. But again, you fall back on what's the most interesting, what's the most relevant, what's the most important, and what can be done in a way where I can explain it to people where they will they will walk away with something.
Yeah, NPR, I think, has the smallest team of almost anybody. We have 2 people, including myself, and I've been at least part-time for the last year, mostly a year, working on an investigation. So that's why it took a year, because it's been kind of busy. Because we only have 2 people, and we have 2 hours in the morning in our morning show and 2 hours in the evening in our evening show, and then our website and our newscast, we have to be particularly careful about how we spend our time. And there are certain stories that I will do just for the website, and if they work out for the website, then I'll do them for the radio. For instance, I did a piece last week, 2 weeks ago, it all blends together, about what appears to be a pattern of the new Trump administration dropping cases that seem to have a valid premise against folks who are loyal to the president or loyal to the priorities of the president. And because that did kind of well on the website, we turned that into radio. Pierre will understand this because he needs pictures, but in order to do a sound-rich radio piece, it takes about double the time of typing for a living, which I used to do for the first more than half of my career. And so, you know, we don't have a lot of engineers and producers to help us. I have to go out and like mic up people and make sure they sound good. And putting that all together takes a little bit of extra time too. The only other thing that I can offer people is an interview with a host. So if we have like a newsmaker, I sometimes will give that person to a host, but sometimes I keep that person for myself because I'm the beat reporter and I don't know how the host experience will be, and I want to make sure it's a good experience for somebody who's telling me things, and so that is a bit of a juggling act as well. You know, we have a website, but we don't put every single story up there. For example, there was a morning, the day after DOJ suggested it wanted to drop the Eric Adams case, a number of things happened. Danielle Sassoon, the acting U.S. attorney in New York, left and her resignation letter became public. And then the next day, the resignation letter of another prosecutor in New York became public. And then more and more and more things happened. And so that was a great NPR story because it was like 8 or 9 very powerful things all together to create like 4.5 minutes of really, really good radio. But things don't always work out that way. And that's why people like Perry and Devlin in particular have a lot more daily bylines than I do.
Probably a good time, open it up.
Thanks so much for doing this. I'm Shrey with PBS NewsHour. One question I had for all of you really is how you got to this point in covering the Department of Justice. Did any of you have a legal background as a person that's kind of understanding the US legal system and the court system and the trial system? I'm kind of constantly fascinated by people who have a really great handle on that. And I'm just kind of curious about how you got to this point and how you kind of came to understand the Department of Justice and the very complex legal system.
Well, I'm not an attorney, but I'm married to one who can be a secret weapon at times. No, I just became interested in law, legal, criminal justice issues, and to this point I've found it endlessly more interesting than politics, which I shouldn't say loudly in Washington, because there's an intersection of so many different things: civil rights, security. There are days when there's a story emanating out of justice that may deal with, concert ticket prices, and we did that story last year.
Yeah.
There was a Swiftie angle to it. So I've just found it to be a beat where anyone who's got a lot of curiosity and willing to work hard can thrive.
I started as a crime reporter in New York. I ended up covering the courts for many years up there. I think that's really still where my heart is. I would still, in a perfect world, I would still rather be covering trials if I could. There's nothing to me more interesting than a trial, hands down, and it's not even close. I moved down here for family. Not even supposed to be here, like the line in the movie. And so, for me, DOJ is sort of a pretty natural thing. I'm basically a one-trick pony. I don't really know how to do anything else. God help the people who ever have to make that decision for me.
I'm surprised when he is.
Well, that's kind of you. So anyway, I just think crime is the most interesting subject I've ever covered. It's always been. I've covered other things, and there's just nothing to me as interesting as a trial. Absolutely nothing.
I'll take it. I've been at the Post for a while now, and I spent a lot of time on the Metro desk. And when I started, I did very kind of local general assignment stuff. And I really wanted to cover a beat. I really wanted to learn, how to source up, how to do the mix of accountability, breaking news, all that. And I really, admired these beat reporters like this. And so they stuck me on, well, I wanted it, I applied, DC schools for, I was there for almost 5 years. And my goal was to really learn how to one day do a beat like this. And the position, I didn't particularly have an interest in DOJ, but I knew it as one of the more, in all these changing journalism roles, one of the more traditional beats. And the job opened up. And I guess if you guys want my advice, I would say, don't be discouraged if you don't get a job, because what I have learned is that it's all kind of a crapshoot and timing as what when you get this. I mean, I think Devlin may have more insight into this, but I think the timing worked out. There was an opening. Devlin was my beat partner when I started on this beat 2.5 years ago, and he is an expert in this beat, and it gave them a chance it gave the paper an opportunity to give someone like me who had no experience in DOJ to be able to try this beat. And so that's kind of, Devlin and everyone on this beat has been very patient and taught me a lot, but it worked out that there was an expert on the beat already. So that's how I got into it. And so I would say, everyone, be open-minded, and if you don't get it, realize it's all about timing and it's kind of a crapshoot. So
When I was in grad school, I found the 1Ls, the young law students, more interesting than my fellow grad school folks. So I went to a lot of law school classes with them, and I saw them change over the course of the 1L year. I don't know if you've known people in this experience, but it can change people's personalities sometimes for the worse. So I took away from that experience that I did not want to practice law, but I wanted to be law adjacent. Then I moved here in the 90s to work for a paper that kind of no longer exists, called Legal Times, covering the local court system. And then I spent many years at the Washington Post. I was hired to cover business. I was not interested in business. I like recriminations. I like litigation. I like fighting. And I like stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is why covering a trial is so satisfying. So I spent many years at the Post covering a wave of white-collar fraud scandals in the early 2000s, which was the most fun I've ever had. And then I covered the DOJ proper since about 2007. So I've covered about 4 or 5 different transitions at this moment, and I'm sadly old enough to remember what the W. Bush era and politicized hiring in the W. Bush era felt and looked like. And now I can tell listeners at NPR how things are different now than they were then. But I do think it's the best beat in the world, but it is like triage every single day.
Devin used a word that, strays from my mind, but it sort of brings me back to the core interest that, puts a little fire in the belly, at a moment's notice, crime. Because there's something about crime and what it says about the human nature. Like last night, as I was saying, I was emceeing this event, and as I'm driving home at 10:15, I get this call from a producer who says, "Hey, there's a story. I'm sad to tell you, Pierre, that Mike put you on Good Morning America tomorrow." And I'm like, I don't want to get up again early. But he told me about it, and it involved 3 military officials, 2 active duty, and 1 Army veteran who are accused of selling secrets to the Chinese, to the PRC. And when you just think about that, your mind just starts tingling like, okay, what's the circumstance? Why would they do this? You know, and then when I got home and finally parked my car, DOJ did something, you know, that they used to be loath to do. They actually had photographs as a part of the complaint that had been filed, and there's a picture of the guy allegedly standing over a military PowerPoint with his iPhone taking pictures. And I was like, how did they find out about that? So it just, again, it's the kind of beat that can generate just curiosity where you find yourself, even though you're tired, just reading further because you want to figure out, well, what's the best way to tell this story? And I had all of a minute to do it on live television, but, you know, just the story got me through it.
And if I could, I would just brag on Perry for a minute, because when she joined the beat, her first week on the beat happened to be the week that they searched Mar-a-Lago. And Perry didn't even process exactly how significant that was for our lives. But that first night, I was just in the office, and I just kept saying as loudly and as quietly as I possibly could, we're so screwed, we're so screwed. And I did not use the word screwed.
Yeah.
And Perry kept saying, why?
Right.
This seems like a great story.
I was on vacation in Chicago, just, you know, taking a few days with family, and my wife just saw me go into total depression, kind of like, because I knew what the next few weeks and months was going to be like.
Yeah.
But total gamer. She like dove in, like we didn't throw her into the deep end of the pool, we threw her into the ocean. And she's doing great. So you don't need to know the beat to learn the beat.
I don't think they knew that was going to happen when they hired me, but yeah.
No, I know. Well, you did it anyway. So who
Yeah,
cares?
no.
Thank you, guys. Grant Schwab here with the Detroit News, though I'm based here in D.C. You guys talked about sort of not wanting to return fire. You have a responsibility to not return fire, report the who, what, when, where, why. But Carrie, you talked about this, giving some context of, I was here during the Bush years, and this is what it was like. So could you guys maybe talk a little about your responsibility for adding context to the stories and kind of communicating how big a deal this is? And, you know, the Trump administration might see that it's returning fire for you to say, this is a big freaking deal. But I don't know, maybe if you could just talk a little about that. What do you think your responsibility for adding that context is?
So the first thing I would say is I always think of it as I am talking to like I'm writing for a person. I'm talking to a person. In my head, I have always used a kid I went to high school with, Jerry Spiegel. No idea what Jerry's doing these days. But Jerry was like a regular guy. Jerry was, I grew up in a Rust Belt town. Jerry was like very much of that town. Like, but I try to think very strongly about who am I trying to explain this to? And if I know who I'm trying to explain it to, I know how I want to say it. I know how much to put in context. And to be honest, like, we don't get paid to write poetry, and we don't get paid to be pretty. Like, we get paid to explain why this matters. That's the only real value add we have to the thing. So context is very important, and I think the internet has only made that more important because, you know, social media and the internet generally are sort of like anti-context machines. And so there's a great book by a woman named Gia Tolentino, which is all about how the internet like makes mountains into molehills and vice versa. And it was the only place I've really sort of seen this explained well. And so our job, I think, we are sort of the elevation experts. And we are there to tell you this is exactly how tall this mountain is. Now, the danger of that, right, is that if you get something, as we do every day, and you have an hour to figure it out, we're not going to necessarily guess the elevation perfectly right every time, which is part of the reason why you have to be calm and deliberate and thoughtful and patient, even with yourself as you're explaining this thing. Like, there are plenty of days in the press room where we will be, you know, loudly yelling to each other and gesticulating as we read through these documents. But what comes through in the work product is very calm, deliberate, and thoughtful work. And so your job is the context machine. Your job is the elevation decider. And so I think everyone here is like, you know, the best people I know at that.
And, you know, the context is often built on perspective, either through experience of covering the beat or learning and reading past stories about the beat. I'll give you a great example. So during the speech to the joint session of Congress, I saw something, but before I went on the air with it, I wanted to make sure my perspective was right. So I had my team make some extra calls. The FBI director showed up at the joint session. And I was like, I don't think I've ever seen that before. And we made calls, and maybe J. Edgar Hoover did it, and we didn't know about it, but that was indicative of something. And it was indicative of the fact that Patel sees himself as a part of the administration, which every FBI director is, but he was clearly comfortable being there. Whereas other FBI directors had looked at that as a venue of politics, so they went the other way. But it's not my job to judge whether it's right or wrong, but it is interesting to note it. That's context. And then one of the things, I think I've been around the longest of anybody in here. I'm dating myself. You learn things like, for example, every FBI director, new FBI director, comes in, and they've all been men so far, but every FBI director comes in, and typically over a period of months, sometimes a year or so, will clean out the old leadership and install the people that they want around them in the immediate headquarters and in the field offices around the country. Now, the difference here is that it happened in a very concentrated way and a very fast way. And you're sort of balancing, okay, it's the right of the incoming FBI director to do this, but what's different here is they're serving in part of an administration where there's a president who believes that he was wronged, that believes that the FBI and DOJ was politicized to attack him in a way he thought was unfair. And so his retribution was a winning, as he said. But then to say, well, I'm not going to let the people I think that played a key role in that keep those jobs. And the balancing act is sort of explaining that in context and just letting the facts be what they are. But, so you have something that may have happened over a period of time and something now happening in a very concentrated way. And our job is to sort of help people understand, well, here's what's different about it. Here's what's important about the difference. And it's exhilarating, but it's also really intense.
And I would add to that, context is a way to also just remain objective and get your point across and show, is this bad or is this good, or how different it is. But it's also a way to get your editor on board for something, if you think something is important. It's a way. I mean, I'll just give a quick example. Last night, I know, and by the way, when we talk about press room, we all know each other because DOJ allows us to work. There's a room in there and we all work together. That's how we know Kevin, and we all have desks, and so we all work together a lot. There was an executive order about Perkins Coie, which is a law firm, which it's one law firm that the Trump, penalized, punished, whatever word you want to use, gave them all these different types of penalties. And the history is that they covered Hillary Clinton's they represented the Clinton campaign and were involved in some of the Russia stuff through representation. And on its face, it sounds kind of boring, like one law firm, like kind of who cares? But I had made a couple calls for the last story for a different story that related to this. And, what people think is that this has an effect of making it so none of the big law firms will ever take, or could have an effect, maybe this is the intention, could have the effect of making it so no big law firms want to take any clients that would go against Trump. And putting it in that context allowed my editor to say, you know what, maybe we should give you a little more space. Okay, let's try to get it homepage play. And which is important to us in this very competitive news environment. And that was it. And just to gut check myself, I called a conservative leaning attorney to be like, what do you think about this? He said that. He basically said what I said. It was, according to legal experts, was the first part I would attribute that to. And I called a more liberal attorney who said the same thing. And, that together, while also talking to the White House reporter, we were able to get a good story, and we proved to our editor. I mean, it wasn't a huge story, but we, I think, were able to pitch it to our editors in a way that was like, no, this is more than a brief. This isn't just a law firm thing. This is a big strategy, seemingly, of the Trump administration. So I think context is knowing that context and making calls, even if it's just to pitch a story to your editor, is really important.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Nicholas Anastasio. I work with National Journal and Hotline. I cover Senate campaigns, so I'm more on the politics side, but we're early enough in the cycle that I'm wanting to look into the candidates that are running so far, in many ways to vet them. What are some of the best resources for, looking, whether that's court cases, whether that's, reports, what is the best way to get primary source documentation?
FEC filings, Federal Election Commission filings, to the extent they've run before or are already taking in money and have reporting obligations. Certainly court searches, assembling a timeline of the person and their prior career, and figuring out whether any of those prior career stages offered suggestions or hints as to competence and experience. And since sexual harassment has been kind of my beat for the last year, that's a question I ask at the start of every reporting process too.
Yeah, so I would say former coworkers are a thing I always go for. This isn't any rocket science, obviously, but former coworkers really valuable and helpful. And LinkedIn is a resource that when I had to do the most of this, did not exist. And depending on what profession those people were in before they became political candidates, LinkedIn can be incredibly useful. So I would always check there. I mean. But I will caution, there is no cheap and easy way to do this. One of the things that's fantastic about journalism, it's a very labor-intensive thing. So when I'm having that emotional reaction to the raid at Mar-a-Lago, my reaction is really about this is going to be so much work. This is going to be more work than we have done, and we've been doing a lot of work. And even in non-emergency settings, just vetting a Senate candidate, it's a lot of work. I think if you go into this thinking well, I'm going to have a lot of downtime and I'm really going to, work on my pottery when I'm not reporting, this ain't that job. This ain't that kind of life in my experience. And so I do think as a practical matter, Senate candidates, and I'll say too, one of the things that's really happened to I used to be a regional reporter before I did this, and there used to be a whole field of reporting that did things like vet Senate candidates, that did dives in their hometowns, in their last hometowns, in their last 5 hometowns. And that doesn't really exist anymore. So by the time it comes to one of you guys to vet a candidate, you may actually be the first person doing this. And I think one thing that's changed drastically from when I started is that you had the resource to fall back on of other news organizations who had probably done this over the years as the person rose to the point where they could be a Senate candidate. And that, in my experience, has largely fallen away because of what's happened in the business. So the one thing I would just caution you all is if you're digging into a Senate candidate and you're well, obviously this person's life has been gone over with a fine-tooth comb already. Depending on what state you're talking about, literally no one has looked.
2 words, George Santos.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah.
Well, right. George Santos, I would argue the dynamic of Santos probably was not even possible 10 or more years ago. Literally not possible. But now it is extremely possible because of the way the business has changed. And so that is both a great challenge. Like I said, it's a lot of work. The job's always a lot of work. But a tremendous opportunity. I mean, there's so much to do. Even when they're not raiding Mar-a-Lago.
Hi, thank you guys so much for doing this. My name's Audrey Decker. I'm a reporter with Defense One. I cover the DoD, and just curious to get your guys' tips on sourcing, especially with the FBI, sensitive agencies where people don't want to talk. How do you find sources? How do you meet these people? How do you gain trust? Any other tips that you have?
I think the simple answer is just doing stories. You meet people who are in that subject matter in these different agencies. Events happen. People show up who are in law enforcement to deal with those events, and you try to make connections. And I always say that journalism is as much about interpersonal relationships and building them as any profession I think that's out there. And it's a process of connecting with people where you can convince them there's value in what we do and that they have a role in informing the public, and then establishing a track record with them where they feel like they can trust you to protect them and do a good job.
One of the things that was very successful for me as I was starting my career and even into the middle was going to things after work. So DOD and DOD adjacent people, there are these federal government contractor associations, there are awards dinners, there are breakfasts in the morning sometimes, or things after work. And it's a way to get some kinds of mid-level and high-level government officials where they may not have as much of a layer of 6 people surrounding them. You can actually make a beeline for them. And importantly, it's a way to make a beeline for people without leaving a digital trace often. So if you want to communicate with somebody and you don't want there to be an email about that, you can have a conversation with somebody that way. And I also found that it was a demonstration that I was a serious person and was seriously interested in the people I was covering to show up for those kinds of things, which a lot of beat reporters didn't want to do because, you want to go home and have dinner with your family. Yeah. And also it's boring. Sometimes it's not boring. There's also often free food, but yeah.
I always joke, all of this is, I would take all that advice. I always joke with my non-journalist friends that I'm super good at rejection because I get it all the time. If we're at a restaurant and they need someone to ask to add extra seats, I'm like, I got this. I get rejected every day. Don't worry about it. They'll probably say no. But my point is, if I could show you my inbox, it's in addition to going all these things, you do cold reach out, especially now. And, some days on a good year, maybe I'm 5% response rate. And I think you just there's no harm in trying. And more than on this beat, than on local politics, I cannot predict who is going to say yes. I just don't know, it's so big that I don't know what's going on in every aspect that I can't say why. And I know I used to, when I started this beat, I would, complain to Devlin. I was like, I just don't understand people's motivation for wanting to talk to you. How can you source up if you don't understand why people would or would not want to talk to you? And I think, I would say just ask a lot of people, and you don't know when they'll say yes. I sent a message to someone, I think, 10 months ago, and they just got back to me last week, and I'm like, victory, that is, that's maybe my success rate's now 6%. But so I would just reach out and don't try to predict who or who will not. I used to try to think, only the older people near retirement will talk to me, but that's all seems to not be true. So just don't predict and reach out and be okay if they don't respond. Don't take it personally.
I think on a beat especially, you have to be patient. And you have to present you have to always be thinking about presenting 2 ideas to the people you talk to. One is that you care very much about what they do. You're not going to vanish in a week because you have to go, cover the Indy 500. 2, you want to help people understand what they do and why they do it. Almost every human being on the planet wants to be understood. And if you can make a connection with someone who feels a strong urge to have their work be understood, they're more likely to talk to you. There's other 2 little just tricks, I would argue. I try to make sure that I reach out to 1 new person every week. And one person a week is a very achievable goal. You don't want to get swamped by the notion of like, I have to source up 50 people. You do not have to source up 50 people. You have to have a process by which you're always adding people. And so one new person a week, whether they engage with you or not, is not the point. But you're always reaching out to one new person a week. And it forces you, in addition to forcing you to reach out to them, it also forces you to think about, what are my blind spots here? What am I really weak on? Or what could I improve with just one or two more people who are experts in X? And it doesn't mean like it has to be the FBI agent. Maybe it's an ex-FBI agent. Maybe it's a former prosecutor. There's a lot of ways to get at the thing without going to the heart of the target right out of the gate, because the heart of the target is the hardest part. The other thing I would say that completely changed how I think about reporting is a book called What Every Body Is Saying. It's by a former FBI agent who just studies body language. And a lot of the things in that book I sort of already knew without being able to articulate it or express it. But when I read that book, I was maybe in my late 30s, I was like, holy crap, this is the key to everything. This is all the things I've been trying to do and like being very hit or miss about. And body language is so important to how people relate to each other. Body language is so important to how whether or not people trust each other. You know, there's a reason why it's very hard to have a heartfelt conversation with a crime victim when there's 20 TV cameras like all pressed in around. It's all Pierre's fault. But like body language, I think we don't pay nearly enough attention to body language. And that book, to this day, I read it 15 years ago and it still blows my mind.
Hi, my name's Hannah Demasay. I work at ABC News. I'm just curious how you guys are approaching kind of just like the new staffing and changes at DOJ, especially given the White House yesterday pushing back at Wall Street Journal, reporting about planning on signing an executive order to dismantle education, the Department of Education. The White House said that was never going to happen, but they were actually planning on doing it. And I'm just curious, like, that was such a direct source, the White House giving them that reporting. I'm just curious if this is like, if you guys are changing your approach about how you're working with that, with direct lines at DOJ, if that makes sense what I'm saying.
Well, we had an experience not so long ago. It was the first press conference of the new Attorney General, where they announced the filing of a lawsuit, but they did not produce the actual case for a number of hours, which was irregular. And so because I work for NPR and because I've been doing this a long time, I told my editor, I'm going to write a story about this when I see the paperwork that has been filed with the court. And other people made a different decision, and I understand why. But it seemed to me that I needed to understand the basis of a lawsuit against a state official before saying the Justice Department was suing a state official. And because most of what DOJ does winds up in court one way or another, that is a valid thing, but you may have a fight with your editor because your competitors in the news business may take a different attack. I'm glad I waited, honestly, because NPR is a broadcast outlet, but we have more time than a lot of other networks do. And so, I wasn't sure how you got to the second 30 seconds of what I would say without fully understanding what this case was about. And so I waited.
I mean, look, I think, to Pierre's point earlier, like, I don't think a lot changes in terms of how you do the work. I do think a lot of the way the business works now is about go, 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 right? I think you also have to always be willing, to Carrie's point, and I think I'm one of the people who didn't wait. So long ago, it was like a week and a half ago. Who can remember? But I think in a business that's always go, 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 go as fast as you can, you also have to like force yourself sometimes to just wait, to just take a beat, take a breath, and think, well, do I have to go now on this? What is the potential upside of waiting versus the potential upside of not waiting, and vice versa? And no one's going to make, like, to Carrie's point, like, I think in a weird way we were both right. I don't think there's a perfect answer to a lot of these things. I think you have to make judgments in real time. And to the degree that there's pushback, I mean, look, sourcing is hard. There's a reason most stories aren't based on anonymous sources. And you should never forget that you are incurring some risk and your own credibility when you engage in sourced reporting. So we had a similar version of that last night with the EO that Perry was talking about the law firm, where, again, I went 180 from my thing the week before, where I was like, you know what, I actually want to wait and see the language of this EO, because this is actually fairly important what the words are. How are they going to go at Perkins Coie? And so in that case, I decided to wait. The exact opposite of the thing I did, 2 weeks earlier. I think you have to sort of be willing to debate it out in your own newsroom. I think newsrooms, one of the things I love about newsrooms is how people disagree and debate and argue. I sometimes read media stories where, like, oh, there was an argument in the newsroom about this story, and I think, well, was it a day ending, and why? Of course there should. If I would be very worried if there was not an argument in a newsroom about coverage. I think debate is healthy. I think disagreement and airing things out are good. The best beat partners I've ever had are people I probably argued with about something almost every day. I'm not going to look at Perry right now. So I think all these things are good. I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think you have to be patient, not just with the world, but with yourself.
Right. And sometimes it's subjective. I mean, if you think about the story that Kerry was talking about, it really is, you could go either way. On the one hand, it was clear that the DOJ under Pam Bondi was going to sue New York over how they handled immigration. So that much was unassailable. But Kerry's right in that, well, let's see what the facts and the law is based on in terms of making that decision. Is it sound? Is it not sound? Whatever. But again, that's the beauty of the job, that there's not a day where your brain is not required to work.
And going back to your point about context, right? I'm old enough to remember the last time an administration sued a bunch of states over immigration, right? So, like, are you using that stream of arguments? Are you using other arguments? Or is what you maybe really want is a headline in newspapers and on the television for the evening news that the Trump administration is going after the leadership of a blue state over immigration? Okay, well, why? What does the law say? Do they have any merit? I want to see the paper. We did see the papers. It took 4-ish hours, I think.
It took a while.
Yeah.
And I would say to you, like, this is my first Trump administration, and I was pretty nervous going into it because I felt like a lot of my colleagues had a just better grasp of how it worked. To your point, is like, if they say they're planning something, how likely is that to change? Should you cover it? Should they not? And I think to what Devlin said is, like, it is trust the reporting process if you're doing a rigorous reporting process. I mean, I have tried not to make, like, any assumptions about the people that I am talking with. I think, like, we've now met lots of spokespeople just 2 months, and everyone is very different. Everyone has different backgrounds coming into this. So, I don't, you don't go in with an antagonistic relationship assuming anyone is lying to you, but you also, just like you do in the Biden administration, make sure that, like, they're telling the truth or they know the facts. Oftentimes it's not that they're not telling the truth, it's that they think they know the facts and they don't know the facts, because I think the communication chain in the Biden versus Trump administration, I would say it's a little more, it's not as linear maybe in this administration. Like, there's lots of ways that DOJ officials hear different things, and that may affect what they tell you. But I think there's a reason why when you do anonymous sourcing, you do 2 sources. I can't tell you already how many amazing one-source stories I have ready to go. But I am sure if I get a second source on a lot of them, the stories will turn out to be false, and that is why you have that rigorous reporting process. And we did that in the Biden administration, and it's, we got to do it in the Trump administration too.
And the start of any new administration is more confusing than other times. Like, the first month is always, I think we would all agree, like, yeah, we don't love that first month. whoever
Yeah.
it is, whatever's going on. That first month is a bit of a bear because you're like, oh, great, here's 20 new people, and I got to make snap judgments about all of their, work habits and conversational habits. Even just sometimes the way a person talks can throw you. So you have to learn a whole bunch of new people, and those people themselves are learning a new building. They're learning a new institution that they've just set foot in. They don't even necessarily know where the cafeteria is.
Literally.
So
yeah, I
yeah.
remember in the early Obama days, people were asking me where things were in the building, and I had a really big story because they really messed something up that was bad, and I think it wasn't malevolent. I think it was just massive early stage incompetence. And finally, they called me and said, will you stop writing these stories? And I was like, when you stop messing up, I'll stop writing these stories. So like equal opportunity, right? Like get your act together, kids, and figure out where the cafeteria is and how process works inside the building.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's always this really weird period of time, first few weeks, months, where DOJ is sorting out its relationship with the White House.
Yeah.
And the way it starts out is never the way it ends up. That's for sure.
It always ends bad. Just
Understatement of the year.
fast forward. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right. So, but we'll have to see.
Correct.
Well, I promised all that a hard stop at 3, but I wanted to add one thing, that you'll never find a more collegial, talented, and humble group than these folks here. And it was my pleasure to work with them. Most of the time I was chasing them because they're such a talented group. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
And it's a pleasure to be here. And I would say that Kevin is skilled, principled, and you're lucky to have him engaging with you in this way.
Very lucky.
Absolutely.
Very kind. Thank you very much.